The courtroom was enveloped in a heavy silence, the kind that weighed on everyone's chest, making each breath feel like an effort. Every seat was occupied, and all eyes were fixed on the man seated at the center of the room. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes sat in his wheelchair, dressed in his crisp military uniform, the medals on his chest catching the glare of the fluorescent lights. His hand gripped the leash of the dog beside him. Ranger, a German shepherd, with a steady and watchful demeanor. To most in the room, Ranger appeared to be just another military working dog, but to Daniel, he was so much more. He was family. Daniel's jaw tightened as the judge addressed him, reminding him that this was likely his final chance to speak. The military had deemed Ranger government property and planned to reassign him to another mission. After years of standing side by side in the line of fire, the thought of losing Ranger now felt like a knife to the heart. Daniel's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the leash, his voice barely strong enough to rise above the suffocating tension in the room. "Your Honor," he began, his tone raw with emotion. "Ranger isn't just a military asset. He saved my life in ways no one here can fully understand. On the battlefield, he pulled me out of danger, shielded me from gunfire, and even warned me of traps I couldn't see. And when I came home, broken and unable to even look at myself in the mirror, Ranger was there. He gave me a reason to keep going. Please, don't take him from me." The room remained still, the air thick with unspoken emotion. A few spectators dabbed their eyes, while others exchanged glances of sympathy and outrage. The judge's expression, however, remained neutral as his sharp eyes studied Daniel for a long, tense moment. Then, just as the judge leaned forward to deliver his ruling, something unexpected happened. Ranger stood abruptly, yanking the leash free from Daniel's trembling hands. The dog moved swiftly toward the judge, barking sharply, his voice cutting through the oppressive quiet like a siren. The crowd gasped in unison, and then the bailiff stepped forward instinctively. Yet, Ranger showed no signs of aggression. His barks were urgent, purposeful, as though he was trying to communicate something critical. "Ranger," Daniel called, his voice trembling with panic. Deep down, though, he recognized the behavior. He had seen it countless times in the field. Ranger wasn't just barking. He was alerting. A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom as murmurs began to rise. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered from the back row. Daniel's chest tightened as he wheeled himself forward, his voice shaking but resolute. "He's not barking for no reason. He only does this when there's danger, when he senses something is wrong. He's trying to warn us." The judge froze, his gavel forgotten in his hand, as his gaze locked on Ranger. The room fell silent again, save for the relentless echo of Ranger's barks. The sharp sounds ricocheted off the high wooden walls, slicing through the tension like a blade. Whatever Ranger sensed wasn't limited to Daniel's plight. The dog knew something no one else did, and for the first time that day, Daniel felt the faintest flicker of hope. This wasn't just a goodbye. Something much bigger was unfolding, and Ranger was determined to make them all see it. The courtroom was silent, save for Ranger's relentless barking. Each sharp sound cut through the thick atmosphere, bouncing off the dark wood-paneled walls and amplifying the tension in the room. The dog's stance was low, his body taut with tension, ears pinned back, and eyes locked intently on the judge's bench. Daniel's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair tightly as he watched Ranger. This wasn't random barking. Daniel knew his partner's body language like his own, and every fiber of the dog's being was screaming that something wasn't right. His heart began to pound, adrenaline flooding his system as memories of the battlefield flashed in his mind. But this wasn't a war zone. This was supposed to be a place of law and order. "Ranger, heel," Daniel called, his voice trembling but firm. Ranger briefly glanced back at him, his sharp eyes seeming to convey reassurance before turning his focus back to the judge's bench. Without hesitation, the dog resumed his purposeful pacing, each movement deliberate, his barking morphing into deep, guttural growls that sent a shiver through the room. The audience's murmurs grew louder, their earlier sympathy for Daniel now tinged with unease. "Lieutenant Hayes," the judge said sharply, his tone laced with irritation, "control your dog or I will have to." "Your Honor," Daniel interrupted, his voice rising with urgency. Ranger isn't disobeying, he's trained to detect threats, bombs, explosives, danger. He wouldn't act this way unless something was seriously wrong. His words fell over the room like a heavy weight, silencing the whispers. For a moment the air was thick with tension, uncertainty rippling through the crowd. Then Ranger abruptly stopped barking. The jarring silence was almost deafening. The dog's body went rigid, his head snapping toward the far end of the courtroom. His ears stood erect, and a low, menacing growl rumbled from deep within his chest. All eyes turned toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, their collective unease sharpening into fear. Daniel's breath quickened as he followed Ranger's line of sight. His pulse thundered in his ears. He had seen this exact behavior before, moments before disaster struck on the battlefield. Ranger wasn't just warning about a threat to Daniel. Whatever danger he had sensed, it was big enough to put everyone in that room at risk. The shift in Ranger's posture was so sudden and intense that it froze everyone in their tracks, even the judge. All eyes turned toward the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the courtroom. A collective unease rippled through the room, the murmurs quickly turning into panicked whispers. Daniel's breathing grew shallow as he followed Ranger's unyielding line of sight. His pulse thundered in his ears. He'd seen this behavior before, back in the war zone, in moments when Ranger uncovered a hidden explosive or signaled an ambush. Whatever Ranger sensed now wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. "Ranger," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling with tension. "What is it? What do you see?" But Ranger didn't budge. His entire body remained rigid, muscles coiled tight as if ready to spring. His growl deepened, the vibrations spreading through the air like an ominous drumbeat. It was a warning, a primal, unmistakable sign of imminent danger. Whatever Ranger had detected wasn't just a threat to Daniel. It was something that could jeopardize every single person in the room. The low growl reverberated through the courtroom like distant thunder, freezing everyone in place. All eyes were glued to the dog, his tense frame a stark contrast to the eerie stillness of the room. Even the judge, moments earlier prepared to reprimand Daniel, seemed unnerved. His gavel hung limply in his hand as he exchanged wary glances with the bailiffs. The air grew charged, an unspoken tension crackling like static. Daniel's breath came faster now, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair like a lifeline. He knew this feeling too well, the suffocating anticipation before something exploded into chaos. Ranger's instincts had been the difference between life and death too many times to count. And when Ranger sounded the alarm, it always meant one thing: danger was close. "Stay calm," Daniel murmured under his breath, though the words felt hollow even to him. The bailiffs, unsure of how to proceed, hovered near the judge's bench. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a wary expression, finally stepped forward. His hand rested uneasily on the weapon at his hip as he muttered under his breath. "It's just a dog, right? Probably reacting to the noise or the crowd." But his steps were slow and deliberate, his movements betraying his own unease. Daniel shook his head, his voice rising just enough to cut through the nervous murmurs of the crowd. "No. Ranger doesn't react to noise or people like this. He's trained to sense threats, things we can't see. Trust me, if he's growling like that, there's a reason." His words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. For a moment, no one moved. The judge, visibly unsettled, finally nodded toward the bailiffs, motioning for them to investigate the door. As they approached, Ranger's growls grew louder, sharper, like a blade cutting through the thick atmosphere. The larger bailiff hesitated, his hand hovering over the metal handle of the door. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's heart pounded furiously as he watched. Every muscle in his body felt taut with anticipation. Ranger's growls turned into short, clipped barks as the handle began to turn. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dim hallway beyond. At first glance, it appeared empty. But Ranger's barking intensified, his eyes locked on something unseen in the shadows. The larger bailiff stepped cautiously into the hallway, his hand still resting on his weapon. He glanced back at the courtroom, his face pale and uncertain, before turning his attention forward again. A moment later, his voice broke the suffocating silence. There's something here," he said, his tone shaky. Daniel leaned forward in his wheelchair, his pulse quickening with dread. Whatever the bailiff had seen, it was enough to set off Ranger's finely tuned instincts, and Daniel knew better than anyone. Ranger was never wrong. The courtroom seemed to grow heavier, as though the tension itself was pulling the air from the room. Ranger's barks echoed sharply, each sound bouncing off the wooden walls. His stance remained unyielding, muscles taut, head low, and eyes laser-focused on the dark hallway. The larger bailiff, now visibly uneasy, took another hesitant step into the hallway. His boots clicked softly against the tiled floor as his hand hovered near his weapon. His entire body radiated caution, as though bracing for something to lunge from the shadows. "What's going on out there?" the judge demanded, his voice cracking despite his attempt to sound authoritative. He gripped his gavel tightly, his knuckles pale as his eyes darted nervously between Ranger and the doorway. Ranger's growls deepened, a low, menacing rumble that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. The larger bailiff glanced back toward the room, his face tight with uncertainty. "I don't see anything," he said hesitantly, his voice measured. "But something doesn't feel right." He turned back toward the hallway, his brow furrowed as though trying to shake off his doubts. "It's quiet. Too quiet," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's heart sank at the words. He had heard them before, too quiet, far too many times, and it had always been a prelude to disaster. "Ranger doesn't react to nothing," Daniel shouted, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "If he's like this, we need to evacuate, now." But the bailiff hesitated, his flashlight beam steady as it swept through the shadows. Ranger's growls didn't falter. Whatever he sensed, it was still there, waiting in the darkness. The words echoed through the stillness, louder than they should have been. Too quiet. Daniel leaned forward in his wheelchair, his stomach twisting into tight knots. He had heard those words countless times before on the battlefield. They always signaled disaster. His voice rose above the mounting murmurs of the crowd, firm and urgent. "Ranger doesn't react to nothing. If he's acting like this, there's a reason. We need to evacuate the room now." But fear and confusion paralyzed the spectators, rooting them to their seats. The smaller bailiff, a wiry man with a determined expression, stepped forward. He drew a flashlight from his belt, switching it on and directing its beam into the dark hallway. The light cut through the shadows, revealing the polished floor stretching into the distance. "There's nothing," the smaller bailiff muttered, though his tone betrayed his unease. His hand trembled slightly, belying the calm he tried to project. Ranger, however, was anything but calm. His growls grew louder, sharper, his barking becoming frantic as his body strained against the leash. Daniel struggled to hold him back, his hands tight on the leash as the powerful dog nearly pulled it from his grip. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clang rang out from the hallway. The sound was unmistakable, piercing the suffocating silence and jolting everyone in the room. The smaller bailiff flinched, his flashlight beam shaking as he instinctively stepped back. Ranger lunged toward the source of the sound, barking ferociously, his claws scraping against the floor in his desperate attempt to advance. Gasps erupted from the courtroom, panic rippling through the crowd like a rising tide. "What the hell was that?" the larger bailiff demanded, his voice tight with alarm as he drew his weapon, aiming it toward the shadows. Daniel's heart thundered in his chest. Raising his voice above the growing chaos, he shouted, "Get Ranger back!" His tone was filled with fear and certainty. "He's never wrong. Something's coming." Before anyone could respond, the metallic clang sounded again. This time it was louder, sharper, as if whatever caused it had drawn closer. The courtroom seemed to pulse with a heavy, invisible energy that sent a wave of dread through the air. Ranger barked ferociously, his body straining against the leash with such force that Daniel's knuckles whitened as he held on. His pulse raced in his ears, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. The larger bailiff stepped cautiously into the hallway, his gun drawn and his eyes scanning the dim corridor. His partner followed close behind, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating empty silence. But it felt anything but empty. Ranger's barking didn't waver. His growls deepened, more insistent, his tension communicating what words couldn't. The judge leaned forward in his seat, his gavel trembling in his hand as fear crept into his voice. "Did you see anything?" he called out, his usual authority replaced by a sharp edge of unease. The larger bailiff glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Nothing yet," he said, his voice low and tight, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might provoke whatever lurked unseen. "But it doesn't feel right." He took another hesitant step, his boots clicking softly on the tiled floor. The quiet in the hallway felt oppressive, heavy with anticipation. In the courtroom, whispers turned to nervous chatter. Spectators clutched their belongings, some edging closer to the exits as the atmosphere of unease spread like wildfire. Daniel wheeled himself forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on Ranger. The dog had gone silent, his ears rigid, his body frozen in place. His eyes remained locked on the doorway, an unwavering focus that sent chills through Daniel's spine. "He's locked onto something," Daniel muttered, his voice trembling but steady. "I don't know what it is, but it's there." Just as the larger bailiff reached the halfway point of the hallway, a shadow moved. It was fleeting, barely visible, but it was enough to make the smaller bailiff stumble back, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. "There!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. The larger bailiff froze, his weapon snapping up, aimed at the darkness ahead. Ranger erupted into barking again, his body lunging so hard against the leash that Daniel nearly lost his grip. "Back up!" Daniel yelled, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "Get out of there!" The judge slammed his gavel in a futile attempt to restore order, but the sharp crack of wood on wood was drowned out by the growing chaos. People rose from their seats, their movements frantic as panic took hold. The metallic clang sounded once more, reverberating through the hallway. It was closer now, sharper, like an alarm resonating deep in their bones. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Ranger barked ferociously, every muscle in his body straining as if he could physically confront the unseen threat. Daniel gripped the leash tighter, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and certainty. Whatever was out there, it was no longer a question of if, it was only a matter of when. From the darkness of the hallway came a sound that silenced the growing chaos. A single, heavy, deliberate footstep. It wasn't rushed or hurried. It was calm. It was purposeful. And it was getting closer. Ranger's barking shifted into a low, menacing snarl, his teeth bared and his powerful body strained forward with such force that Daniel had to brace himself in his wheelchair to keep from being pulled forward. A suffocating tension filled the courtroom, every pair of eyes glued to the dark hallway as if dreading the source of that sound. The judge slammed his gavel again, shouting, "Everyone stay calm." But his command fell on deaf ears. People began rising from their seats, clutching their belongings as if holding on to something tangible would protect them from the unseen threat. The larger bailiff, standing in the hallway with his gun raised, was frozen in place. His partner remained just behind him, the flashlight beam dancing nervously across the walls, catching shadows but offering no answers. "Get out of there!" Daniel's voice cut through the growing noise, sharp and commanding. "Whatever it is, it's not safe." His words sliced through the room like a blade, but the larger bailiff didn't retreat. Instead, he squinted into the dim corridor, his jaw tight. And then it moved again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The shadow shifted slowly, deliberately, with purpose. The smaller bailiff let out an audible gasp, his flashlight trembling in his unsteady hand. "There's someone there," he stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. The flashlight beam flickered and caught something for the briefest of moments, a tall, looming silhouette. It was there and gone, in an instant, retreating back into the darkness. But it was enough to send a wave of fear rippling through the room. The larger bailiff's grip on his weapon tightened, his voice steady but low as he barked, "Show yourself. Step out where I can see you." The only response was silence. A silence so thick and oppressive it stretched unbearably, freezing everyone in place. Ranger's barking hit a fever pitch, his teeth gleaming in the dim light as his body coiled like a spring ready to lunge. And then, it happened. A figure stepped into the light, slowly, calmly, as though it had all the time in the world. It was a man. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and his hands were tucked into the deep pockets of a heavy coat. His movements were deliberate, his posture oddly relaxed despite the tension he was causing. He stopped at the edge of the flashlight's beam, tilting his head slightly as if he were amused by the scene before him. Ranger's growling turned feral, his claws scraping furiously against the floor as Daniel fought to keep control. "Who are you?" the larger bailiff demanded, his gun fixed on the figure. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another slow step forward, the faintest hint of a smirk curling at the corner of his lips, just visible beneath the hood's shadow. Daniel's chest tightened as a deep, unshakable dread filled him. Whatever this man was, whatever he wanted, it wasn't good. Something about him felt wrong. Not just threatening, but fundamentally wrong. The man raised his hand slowly, a deliberate motion that made both bailiffs tense and grip their weapons tighter. "Relax," the man said, his voice low, calm, and unnervingly confident. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." But the way he spoke, the way his words lingered in the air like a chill, only made the room feel colder. Daniel's gut twisted. He knew the man was lying, and so did Ranger. The dog's constant, low growls vibrated through the room, a visceral warning no one could ignore. The man stood still, just at the edge of the hallway, his figure partially illuminated by the shaky flashlight beam. He exuded an unsettling calm, as though he were savoring the unease radiating through the room. The bailiffs held their positions, their hands steady on their weapons, but their trembling betrayed the nerves beneath their training. Daniel's heart hammered as he stared at the stranger, every instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. "Step forward, slowly," the larger bailiff ordered, his voice tight with authority, though the undercurrent of fear was unmistakable. The man tilted his head slightly, still obscured by his hood, before taking another deliberate step forward. His boots clicked softly against the tiled floor, each movement calculated and slow, as if he were savoring every moment of their attention. Ranger erupted into furious barking again, lunging so hard against the leash that Daniel's sweaty grip nearly gave way. "Ranger, no," Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice shaking. "He knows something's not right." His words were too quiet to reach the crowd, but they seemed to carry to the judge, who glanced at Daniel with a mix of fear and confusion. The stranger's slow approach came to a halt, his figure now fully visible under the flashlight's beam. His hands remained in his pockets, his posture unshaken by the weapons aimed at him or the snarling dog ready to strike. Daniel's instincts screamed louder with each passing second. Ranger wasn't reacting to noise or nerves, he was reacting to him. The smaller bailiff stepped forward, his flashlight steady in one hand while the other hovered near his holster. His voice cracked slightly as he addressed the stranger. "Sir, identify yourself now," he commanded. The man slowly lifted his head, just enough for his face to become partially visible beneath the shadow of his hood. His eyes were sharp, cold, and piercing, carrying an intensity that sent an involuntary shiver down Daniel's spine. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man said, his voice calm but unnervingly hollow. The man's hand moved slowly toward his pocket, and the bailiffs instantly stiffened, their weapons raised in response. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and someone in the back whispered, "He's got something." The tension in the room stretched to a breaking point, fragile and ready to snap. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to act, but he remained frozen, his hands locked around Ranger's leash as though it were the only thing anchoring him. The man pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing a small metallic object. "Drop it!" Both bailiffs barked in unison, their voices sharp with urgency. The man stopped, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as he held the object up for all to see. It glinted under the dim light, revealing itself to be a simple key. "Relax," the man said smoothly, his voice unnervingly composed. The sight of the key did nothing to ease the tension. If anything, the unease thickened. Ranger's growls deepened, his eyes locked on the stranger as if he saw past the distraction. Daniel's grip on the leash tightened as he whispered under his breath, "It's not what it looks like. He's hiding something." The man's smirk widened, almost as if he could hear Daniel's thoughts. The room grew suffocating with dread, every eye fixed on the stranger holding the key. Ranger's barking was relentless, his growls vibrating through the courtroom like a warning siren no one could ignore. Daniel's hands trembled as his instincts roared louder than the chaos around him. This man wasn't just a threat. He was the beginning of something much darker, much larger. "Drop the key and back away." The larger bailiff ordered again, his weapon steady but his voice strained. The smaller bailiff edged closer, his flashlight illuminating the stranger's face more clearly. Yet, the man remained unfazed by the guns pointed directly at him. His gaze flickered to Ranger, and his tone shifted to something almost conversational. "That dog," he murmured, his voice low and deliberate. "He's special, isn't he? Always knows things before they happen. That's what makes him so valuable." The weight of his words hit the room like a physical blow. Daniel's stomach dropped, a cold fear gripping him. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice sharp but trembling. Ranger barked louder, lunging against the leash as if trying to shield Daniel from a threat only he could perceive. The man's smirk grew darker, his eyes glinting with something sinister. Slowly, he raised the key higher, his movements deliberate, almost taunting. "You'll find out soon enough," the man said, his voice chilling in its certainty. And then, with a sharp metallic click, the man turned the key. The sound was subtle, but its impact was immediate. Ranger erupted into a frenzy, barking louder than ever before. Chaos exploded in the courtroom. People screamed, chairs scraped violently against the floor, and a wave of fear swept over the room. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently. In the brief moments of pure darkness, gasps and shouts filled the air, accompanied by the sound of hurried footsteps and scrambling bodies. When the lights flickered back on, the man was no longer alone. Behind him, emerging from the hallway like living shadows, were two more figures. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were calculated, their presence radiating menace. Each carried sharp, metallic weapons that gleamed ominously under the unsteady light. Daniel's heart raced as his eyes darted to Ranger. The dog's growls had reached a primal intensity, every muscle in his body coiled and ready to strike. Whatever was happening, it was no longer about one man with a key, it was something far bigger, something that had just begun. The courtroom descended into chaos. Spectators surged toward the exits, their voices rising in confusion and terror. Chairs scraped loudly as people scrambled to escape, adding to the cacophony of the moment. The two figures behind the stranger moved deeper into the room, their presence enough to amplify the dread hanging in the air. Ranger barked incessantly, his body low and tense, every movement a signal of his readiness to defend Daniel. Daniel's grip on the leash tightened, his own adrenaline surging. He knew without a doubt that whatever this was, it was far from over. The larger bailiff stepped forward, standing his ground as he focused his flashlight squarely on the stranger. "Stay where you are," he commanded, his voice firm despite the rising panic in the room. But the stranger didn't stop. Instead, he took another slow, deliberate step forward, his expression unnervingly calm. Behind him, the two shadowy figures mirrored his pace, their synchronized movements amplifying the suffocating tension. The stranger finally spoke, his voice smooth and measured, cutting cleanly through the chaos. "No one needs to get hurt," he said. "All I want is the dog." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, each beat loud and insistent, but his resolve didn't waver. Ranger growled low, his sharp gaze locked on the stranger, unwavering and fierce. "You're not taking him," Daniel said, his voice strong but laced with emotion. He wheeled himself slightly closer to Ranger, his grip on the leash firm and protective. "He's not just a dog, he's my partner, my family. I don't care who you are or what you think you're entitled to, you're not taking him." His words lingered in the charged air, silencing the crowd. For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. The stranger's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as he studied Daniel. His voice cooled, laced with frustration. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, his gaze shifting to Ranger. "He's special, you know that, but keeping him will only make things harder for you." Daniel's jaw tightened, his determination unwavering. His grip on Ranger's leash didn't falter. "Ranger stays with me," he said, his voice steady and firm. The murmurs in the crowd began to swell again, some pleading for calm, others whispering fearfully about what might happen next. The tension in the room was unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity. Ranger barked sharply, the sound breaking the room's trance-like stillness. His focus on the stranger was absolute, his posture tense, every muscle ready for action. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair, his chest tight with emotion but his resolve as strong as ever. He was ready to do whatever it took to protect the one being who had always stood by him, through war and beyond. Whatever the stranger's intentions were, Daniel was sure of one thing: Ranger wasn't going anywhere. This standoff was far from over. The room remained frozen, the air thick with unease. The stranger stood motionless, his cold eyes fixed on Ranger. Low, rumbling growls rolled from the dog, reverberating like distant thunder. Beside him, Daniel sat with both hands gripping the leash tightly, his gaze unwavering, a mirror of Ranger's loyalty and defiance. The two figures behind the stranger remained still, their presence looming, adding weight to the already unbearable tension. It was a standoff, a quiet battle of wills that stretched endlessly. Breaking the silence, the judge cleared his throat. His voice, though trembling, carried authority. "You've disrupted a court of law. This ends now," he declared. "Bailiffs, escort these men out of here." The bailiffs, regaining their composure, moved cautiously forward. Ranger barked sharply again, his teeth bared, his eyes following every movement the intruders made. The stranger raised a hand slowly, signaling his companions to stop. His expression shifted, not anger, but something resembling resignation. "This isn't over," he said calmly, his voice heavy with an ominous certainty. "You think this is just about the dog, but it's so much bigger than that. You'll see soon enough." He took a step back, the smirk returning to his face. But this time, there was no warmth in it, only cold calculation. "For now, I'll leave. But make no mistake, he belongs to us, Daniel, and we'll be back." Daniel's chest tightened, but his grip on Ranger's leash never loosened. His voice was clear and firm, cutting through the growing whispers in the courtroom. "He belongs to no one but me," he said, "and whatever it is you're after, you'll have to go through both of us." For the first time, the stranger faltered. His eyes narrowed as he regarded Daniel, as though reassessing him. But he said nothing more. With a curt motion, he signaled to his companions, and they retreated the way they had come. The tension in the room didn't lift until they disappeared through the same doors they had entered. The silence that followed was deafening. Slowly, spectators began to return to their seats, murmurs rippling through the crowd as they struggled to process what had just happened. The judge exhaled shakily, setting his gavel down on the desk. "This court is adjourned," he said, wearily, his voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the crowd. But Daniel didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the door, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. Finally, Ranger sat down, his growls fading into a tense silence. Though his posture relaxed slightly, his alertness didn't waver. Daniel reached down, his hand brushing gently over Ranger's head. "You did good, buddy," he murmured, his voice heavy with gratitude and exhaustion. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to feel a sliver of relief. Whatever the stranger's plans were, for now they were gone. But he knew deep down this wasn't over. And when the fight came, he and Ranger would be ready. Together.